Hi, this is Dr. Christopher Perrin, and welcome to this episode of The Christopher Perrin Show. This is a podcast that's a part of the True North.fm podcast, and today I am delighted to have Dr. Anika Prather in the studio. Anika is a colleague, a friend, and the recent author of The Black Intellectual Tradition, published by Classical Academic Press. Anika, thanks for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
We're going to be talking today about the Classical Canon. What is it, and who is in it, and why, and probably a few other things that are going to come up during the course of our conversation. The canon, of course, has been a great blessing over centuries. It's just, from one way of defining, this is a collection of literature that's been considered by many almost universally to be good books, kind of an archive of human wisdom, a treasury that we would want to keep and pass down to others for the benefit of any generation, the present generation, the future generation. And it's a collection that is growing, and it's kind of alive, isn't it? It's not like when we think of a list of books, that you put it on paper, it can, something about that exercise, I think it does need to be done. We do need lists of books, but that can also kind of relegate it to a page as if you've got it under control. But as we've described it, we've also realized it's alive, and that you've said, even though it's something that's alive and beautiful and gives life, it's something you want to protect. In other words, it's not completely fluid. It's not alive in the sense that it's just kind of growing willy-nilly like a virus going here and there. It's alive like an organism that is a tree, say, growing and branching forth. And so there's variety already there. So I want to pass it on to you. I'm thinking the canon may be like a tree. That is one thing. It's a tree. But that tree has many parts. And the tree is ramifying, growing, and it changes in season, and it bears fruit. And it sustains us. So you used the tree analogy in a previous talk, so I'm throwing it back to you. Why is that helpful, and what does it suggest to you?
I think in this season that we're in the world, where there's this work to be done with diversity or inclusion or what have you, there are these conversations happening about we have to put more on the list. I agree that there needs to be a conversation about that, but I think we have to be very careful because, as I said to someone we were having this conversation, and I said, well, why don't you I think they were talking about going to college. I said, why don't you just go get a degree in English and you can just, have a list. I said, when it comes to the canon, what sets it apart from any other reading list? And we talked earlier about Mortimer Adler's philosophy. I think many people don't fully understand. I think people have made assumptions that he and a bunch of non-Black or people or people who were not people of color got together and just said, we're just going to choose these books. And that's not what happened. And I think that's something that people need to understand, that there was an actual science to creating this list of the great books of Western civilization that involved thousands and thousands of hours of reading through the books and seeing which books are speaking to which books and building on which books and which thoughts and which themes. And then they were cataloged so that we could know these sets of books throughout time have consistently had this conversation around this particular theme of love or friendship or government. And so if we're going to protect it, we need to make sure that we're using that standard for how we expand it.
Yes, so you mentioned, therefore, some criteria that Adler and his team used over many years, really, of study to select books and create not only a list that they published, but a list beyond the list, because they couldn't publish everything. They were limited by time, space, and money, and so on. So we pulled out one of the books. This is one of the books from this is not the Syntopticon, but this is Boswell. But there's the list, like the essay on prudence, and after there's a description of what prudence has been throughout the centuries, there is a list of books in the collection that you could go to and read on various subtopics under the general topic of prudence. And then there's another list of books that you could read that aren't published in the set, just showing that the list was pretty large, and it's a list that's larger than any one person can master and study. So if we can't even read everything in the canon as they're listing it, what does that mean for our study?
I know. I mean, Mortimer Adler, he has a kind of a guidebook to his collection, so you can know. And what he does is, in this book, it's not in print anymore, but you can usually find it on eBay or Amazon as a used book. I have a copy of it. The first part of it maps out each author and how they build on the other. And the second part is the reading lists. And according to him, it would take you about 10 years to finish all of the books.
I see.
So, of course, I think he knew, but I think his idea was being a lifelong learner. And the question about how do we know what to read, I have a hard time answering that because I'm afraid someone will say, okay, Anika and Chris said to do this, and that's what I will do.
To write lists for all times, all regions, all places, all languages, that would be ludicrous. We just can't do that.
We can't. But what we can say is, what I feel Mortimer Adler was doing for humanity was saying, it wasn't necessarily that he was saying everything else is wrong and horrible and inferior. I am choosing not to interpret his work in that way. But for educational purposes and for educating the next generation, he was saying, we have done all these thousands of hours of research so that every family member can know these are the books that have shaped the mindset of the world and of America. And if you can have access to this literature and read it for yourself, you will build more and more your literacy of what's going on here. Actually, it protects us from the very binary way the world is right now. Because reading through this is opening you up to so many different philosophies and thinking that you can be in conversation with. And so I think it's not so much how do you know. I think that's something, I think we first start off with saying, this is a very authentic system for reading. And if you can trust that, then you have to decide what would work for you.
You have to make some prudent decisions about what you can do with the children you have, the school you have, where you are, place and time. And in my experience visiting lots of classical schools, there are not identical reading lists. And another thing I've noticed, for example, one school might read all of Dante, all 3 books of the Divine Comedy, and another will say, well, we don't want to read Virgil too and Homer. We can't get this all done, so we'll just read the Inferno. And then we'll read the Aeneid. And then, and schools are trying to, and how many schools read Paradise Lost? Do you get to read every one of the epics? Time and resources require different kinds of adjustments. And so there can be, like a garden, a number of beautiful gardens that are different. But I'm thinking about also the distinction between reading great books that are a part of the accepted, received canon of great literature that, say, Adler would put on a list for us, and good books that are outside of it that might still be worth reading. And I think those are 2 different questions, because in a classical homeschool or school, you might want to read X percentage of all of your books from the received canon. But maybe not 100%. Right? I'm thinking about how Lewis says, now he may be speaking to adults and not 8th graders, but he says for every new book you read an old book, almost alternate 50-50. So Lewis seems to think we should be reading some contemporary literature. But I think sometimes there's some confusion. Boy, if you were to read, say, Marilyn Robinson's Gilead, she's a contemporary living artist, a great novelist, in my opinion. She won a Pulitzer Prize for that. She's a Christian novelist, amazing woman. If you were to add that to your 12th grade literature list, are you adding that to the canon? My answer would be no. No. But you're reading another good contemporary book Hopefully your reading of the canon is helping you to make a wise choice about a contemporary book that you can't yet even judge is going to be a part of the canon in, say, the next 100 years.
I think reading from the canon helps us identify what good books to read. So, I have my students often read Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. It's a phenomenal book. And I think I have identified that as a quality book to read based on my experience from reading from the canon. It just the canon gives you a familiarity with the quality in which people tell human stories. And that notion of ones that talk about the universal questions. Because sometimes a book could be really good, but you can tell there's an agenda to make you accept a certain ideology. And that is kind of forced on you in the book. And I have actually started out reading a book. It's really good. Once I begin to feel myself kind of trapped into thinking one way about something, I automatically know, wait, I don't think this is the book I need to be reading.
That's interesting because often in the canon, and Adler and others will say this, what you find in the great conversation of the canon is an engagement of those ideas.
Yes.
Right? So you would find Machiavelli talking about virtue and maybe disparaging it and trying to reinterpret the virtue tradition, but he's dealing with Aristotle, right? Yes. He's not trying to hide it.
Yes.
So they're having the argument, they're having the conversation, and you're invited in.
Kindred by Octavia Butler. Like, it had me, whenever a book makes me so curious about so many different things I thought I understood is when I know I've gotten a good book or a book of the canon. So I thought I had a pretty clear understanding on race relations. Her book made me question that thinking about our interconnectedness and how we really can't fight it, and that and the dangers of fighting it. Like, you could actually mess up the future if you keep fighting it. And that in this process of wrestling with our interconnectedness, you may lose a piece of yourself, but you are still whole and meaningful. And so books that cause me to wonder more, I think it's when the book evokes me to think and ask myself more questions.
You mentioned the universal questions, and then you're reminding me of how Adler talks about the qualities of the true, good, and beautiful. That books that help, and as he describes truth, books that help us to see what's real, so that our thoughts might, as much as possible, approximate the real state of affairs. For him, that's one way of thinking of truth. Maybe you call it the correspondence theory of truth. But he's not shy about that. Great books are trying to help us understand reality. We can never understand it completely or totally, but a great book is helping you to see something that's true. And I think what you were describing from Octavia Butler is the same idea. You were able to see in a fresh way that maybe caused wonder that black and white, we are interconnected despite whatever differences and difficulties we are of a common shared heritage.
Yes. And these and they challenge you. Another thing I did in my dissertation was another part of the etymology of the word great was it grates. It grates. It is constantly rubbing against.
It's a friction and a
challenge.
Yes,
there's a friction and a challenge to it. So many times people have misunderstood the word great when we say great books as to saying it's better, but they challenge your thinking. They grate against what I thought I knew to be true. And they make me go on this journey to uncover these hidden truths that maybe my own experiences have blinded me from seeing. And so when I choose a book, it raises those kinds of questions for me. Like a good book, and this is when we talk about children's book. So at my school, we do this thing called the Common Read. And we do it so that we could do it school-wide. It's done with children's picture books. So even the older kids do it. And we have this big discussion together 3 times a year on a book. And so I try to pick diverse books. And so we did this book called Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins. And it's a wonderful book, but the book caused you to really have a conversation with one another, ways we can stand up for what we believe in. Like, this wasn't a book to indoctrinate my students to be Jewish. It was a book about Herschel's courage to stand up in the face of these demons who did not want him to celebrate Hanukkah. And how can we connect that to our human experiences of standing up for what we believe in when everyone else is against you?
So are you saying that Christians can read books that are not written by Christians and still learn from them?
Yes, absolutely.
And of course, to those in the Christian in the audience who are Christians, that's a part of the history of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
Augustine being one of the chief examples, who was loved Plato, and finds Plato, or Clement of Alexandria would say that just as the Hebrew scriptures were was like a tutor leading us to Christ. He says Greek philosophy for the Greeks was like a tutor leading the Greeks to Christ.
Well, I mean, to that point, what was Socrates and Aristotle doing? Martin Luther King says that he challenged. He was a gadfly that challenged the air truths of his time, which is what got him in trouble. But he didn't just do that to be difficult. Through reading and wonder and observation and allowing your mind to sense what's around you, he began to question the faith that was a part of his culture.
And the received opinion. And
so he, as a result, he came to recognize that there was something. Sometimes I was like, God, are you sure Socrates didn't make it in? But but he came to know that there was something. Okay, so Socrates is put to death. He's gone. Aristotle, his student, picks up where he left off. And he writes something like Parts of Animals, where he recognizes through dissecting different animals that each creation has something in themselves that has an essential being. They were created to fulfill a purpose. Now, Aristotle was not a Christian. That's not what I'm saying. But he was beginning to tap into something, that there is something out there.
A telos, an end.
Yes. Nothing is random.
Yes.
And so when I think of the word great books, can you imagine maybe the fear Socrates must have felt when he realized what we're believing is not true? And I have to be the one to tell the world that I might lose my life by unveiling this truth that all of the world has embraced, right?
He was considered a corrupter of youth.
Yep. Yes.
And so, an atheist.
Right? And so I struggle. I can identify with that because here I am in a world as a woman who's endured racism, who can see racism play out around her and in her life and in the world around her. And yet I am saying, let's read these books together, because I've discovered in history that a lot of people who look like me have read these books to make sense of their situation. And I'm going to be crucified for saying that. But that's what great books do. They rub against what you thought to be true, and they challenge you to question. And Aristotle even said it. He says, it's a paraphrase, wisdom begins in wonder. Or he says, the only thing that I know is I don't know anything, basically. So he says those kinds of things because we've become so confident that this is the truth. When we read works of the canon and works that have some of these attributes of the canon, we should be saying, or they should drive us to say that let's question what we thought we knew.
Yeah. So this prompts me to go back to something you said earlier about protecting it, because why would if it's this living tree, there's a sense in which we would break the metaphor if we say we can add to it, because you don't put an apple on an apple tree,
right?
It kind of grows its own apples. There's something about the canon that has its own independent life that we merely recognize, but it is possible, and so it ramifies, it grows, and it changes in ways that are lovely over the centuries. but it's of a piece, it's of the same tree.
Yeah.
But someone could try to chop it down.
Yeah.
So would you talk about why you think it's important to protect it? And what do you mean by that?
I think that one thing that, and I'm talking about Mortimer Adler's canon. I like to clarify that's what I mean. And his canon kind of can direct you to other. I think there's a Catholic canon. There are different canons I know, but
Different lists.
Different lists. But but I would venture to say that what I'm gonna say about Mortimer Adler's canon is probably true of the others. That when they were established as being a canon, there was some understanding they had about this collection of books and how it will help humanity's understanding and wealth of knowledge. With regards to Mortimer Adler, when he began to track the conversations that these authors that were having with one another over centuries, began to unveil the realities of our humanness as it really is, that pieced together like a tapestry, we would develop a clear understanding of humanity past, present, and then could project what may happen in the future. And a lot of people misunderstand that as me saying that humanity began in Western culture. That's not true. And the classical authors who wrote didn't feel that was true. They acknowledged that their knowledge came from those who came before them. When we mess up that, we run the risk of diluting that story and that understanding.
In other words, if we were to just kind of willy-nilly allow ourselves to say, well, I don't like that. Let's just let's cut these books out that have been read for centuries. And we found a manuscript that nobody's read before, but it happens to be written by somebody that maybe we would like to be have been represented. Let's put them in by some kind of modern criteria.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, in our own modern moment, we might have certain concerns. So for, like Lewis says, every age goes wrong in a certain way, but not in the same way. And so the reading of the old books can correct our own age. And I think that's what you're getting at. Like you read the old books and you sheds light on your current moment and you see it in a different light and you think, maybe I got this part wrong.
I mean, I think a good example of that would be Martin Luther King in that jail cell in Alabama. And he has, a lot of times we read Letter from a Birmingham Jail and we imagine him in a library in his study with his books writing. But Coretta Scott King describes it in her book, My Life, My Love, My Legacy. She describes his circumstances when he wrote that letter. And he had no paper, no pencil, no books. He was just in a jail cell. And he is sitting there trying to make sense of his situation. He's afraid. That's one thing she talked about, how afraid he didn't know he was going to be lynched. He was terrified. Matter of fact, I found that in her writing, she talked about how Martin Luther King suffered from severe depression and that he knew most of his life he was going to die tragically and how he lived in a state of dread constantly because of that. But it was in reading the Bible and this collection of literature that he was able to make sense of his situation, and he was able to find the words to articulate to help others make sense of his situation. And we see that pattern happen with almost everyone. There's a poem written by Phyllis Wheatley about Niobe on the death of her children. And in it, she expresses what a mother goes through when she loses her children. So I can imagine Phyllis Wheatley, taken from her mother, finds this poem and is able to, she gets some type of healing from recognizing whoever wrote this poem must understand the pain me and my mother must feel. And this collection of works, it keeps you from having to do all the investigative work to find out what book can really speak to my soul in this way.
Now you're reminding me of Douglas reading that dialogue written by Epictetus, who was himself a slave who was freed and became this philosopher teacher, and writes a dialogue of a slave speaking to his master, arguing for his freedom, and it's a very persuasive argument. As we look at this collection of a large amount of literature, in a particular moment, like Douglas's moment shortly after the founding, mid-1800s, he would then say, what can I read from the canon that would help me today? And he could have read Aristotle's on the parts of animals.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that might have benefited him.
Yeah.
But reading Epictetus
Yes. Yes.
might have needed to be selected
Yep.
for that time and place.
Yeah.
So it seems like the canon's got this flexibility too. That's another way that it's alive. It can speak to you in a particular cultural moment that you might not be able to predict, and it's there to correct and help and guide and change.
The authors, many of the authors, have not been tainted by the racial and societal chains that we have. So when you read it, you come face to face with their universality.
It's the fresh air. It's like fresh air.
It is. When I first started reading from the canon, it was such a relief where I could just read something and just know it was about being human.
And you knew they weren't prejudiced by some concern of our particular time and controversy, right?
Right.
They were speaking from 1800 years ago.
Yeah, and just about something they went through.
Yeah.
So like if I read, I'm just about to finish Little Flowers of St. Francis of Assisi. And St. Francis was not sitting there saying, I'm going to write this book so white people will enjoy only my literature. I don't want this for black people. He literally was just writing about the consecrated life. What does it mean to live in a way where you have given up everything in this world for faith? And these are the adventures I went on by making that decision. And that book met me at a time where I needed to have someone reveal to me how magical it is to live a life of consecration in that way. The revelations you receive from God, how wonderful it is to give of yourself in service to humanity, to recognize the power of me choosing to live this way could cause somebody else to find redemption in some way. That has nothing to do with the color of my skin or your skin.
It becomes at that moment just merely human.
Yep. Yes.
Right? And we've talked about this, that this tradition is humanitas, one of the words that meant just simply education. There was a time when people like Francis were writing outside of our current frame of left and right, woke and anti-woke, racist, anti-racist. He was in a different category, and therefore it comes like a kind of like fresh water or a tonic, or and it's as you say, it's a relief.
It's a relief.
You can leave in some sense, the tensions of our own time. Hear a clear voice that's speaking to us all as humans, and then when you come back into our time, it gives you a perspective on it that can be something like, it can either inspire you or it can be a corrective. It can confirm something in some cases.
Confirm something. Liberate you. It can liberate you in some way. Frederick Douglass says it liberated me. Mortimer Adler, for example, his list stops in, I guess, the late 70s, early 80s, and people are wondering, should we keep building on it? What should we do? He was choosing books that were written in a way that are liberating in that way. And that's why we have to understand how these lists were created before we start trying to expand them. It cannot just be, we need more Black people. It can't not just be, we need more women. Those things are important. I agree with that. But that can't be the only reason we're expanding. We're expanding to continue to grow the body of knowledge that has spanned centuries for the good of humanity.
So you're reminding me, like, we have, right now we live in an ideological age where there's new ideologies being created, it seems, every year or two. But, if you try to take your particular ideology that somehow has become important to you and then say, I want that in the canon. You're making a move that kind of violates the metaphor of it being this living tree that grows. Not that the canon wouldn't inform whatever your ideology is. It might challenge it. It might confirm it. You might find something lacking in the canon for some reason. But the canon has established its own authority that really has for so long beckoned us to learn from it before we would deign to instruct it. And that, I think, is hard for many because we live in a very individualistic age where it's hard to submit to any kind of wisdom that is, or acclaimed wisdom. Because aren't I wise? Why should I submit to anything? if there were to be criteria for what the canon means, a standard.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a criterion. Does it measure up or in? And over the years, it has evolved, and people have kind of universally said Shakespeare should be in. But the standard seems to be, according to Adler, at least one of the standards would be the true, the good, and the beautiful.
Yeah.
If we were to say the books that Adler tried to put in the canon are qualified because they bear beautiful fruit that is an attempt to understand reality is true, living together as humans in a way that is good.
I think we have to define true, good, and beautiful, because in this journey I've been on and wanting to have these conversations in the classical education world, when I talk about we've got to do more to show how these books connect to all people, I have actually been told by leaders in this movement that for right now, we're not going to focus on that. We want to focus on the true, the good, and the beautiful. And so I'm saying this, so are you saying that there's nothing about people of color or welcoming people of color that would fit that?
Seems like the true, the good, and beautiful is human.
Is being human, right? And so if we're human, then why aren't we having conversations about how to make this simply magical tradition accessible and welcoming to all? Like, we should all want this. And this can be done without leaving politics. This can be done without denying your own heritage. If you're proud of the founding of America because that's the story you have, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. My people survived the founding of America. That's my story, and I'm proud of it. And so I think we have to get out of making people ashamed of trying to bring their story in conversation with this tradition. We almost act like facilitating that is against the true, the good, and the beautiful. But actually, it is beautiful.
It doesn't have to be a move to subvert the tradition of the canon.
Exactly.
Because the canon is already human and inclusive, asks universal questions.
Yep.
And you've also mentioned that it's kind of before the categories of race, right? Which is interesting. It's another way that reading in this tradition can challenge our current and contemporary sensibilities. Yeah. And there's, of course, things we would criticize. The Greeks, for example, were comfortable with slavery.
Yeah.
But they were also, in various ways, saying things kind of like Jefferson did that challenged it. The seeds of its demise were there too. Yeah. Like even the slaves that the Greeks had were not held as racial slaves. These differences are lost on us until you go back on the tradition. For how long did I think, as a naive kind of college student, that slavery had to do with skin color?
I mean, America ushered in this dividing line between color of skin. My mom and dad both went to Howard University, and they were telling me, even though it was an HBCU, there was this rule called the paper bag test, that if your skin was darker than a paper bag, you may have some challenges getting in to an HBCU. Nanny Helen Burroughs, she was a student of Anna Julia Cooper and went on to start a classical school for Black girls. And the reason she started a school is because when she tried to go teach in regular schools, these Black public schools told her she was too dark, so they wouldn't let her teach. Where did we get the notion that even in the Black community, we are colorized? Colorism is there. And that was ushered in from slavery. If you are brown or Black, you are inferior, you are less than human, you go work in the fields. Every once in a while, quite often, you would have a master have relations with an enslaved person, and they would birth lighter-skinned children. And on the plantation, lighter-skinned children, I'm going somewhere with this, I hope you all can follow me, lighter-skinned enslaved people had certain jobs in the plantation house, doing less dangerous or stressful jobs. Whereas a darker skinned enslaved person, like say someone like Sojourner Truth, who was literally used like a donkey to pull and carry, logs and whatever across the plantation, whereas the others got to be in the house taking care of the master's children and cooking. This colorism that was formed through this racist system that was in early America is ushered into the African American community. And this is what Du Bois said, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Right? There's another line he says, across the color line I glide, arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas. I summon Aristotle and what soul I will, and they all come graciously with no scorn nor condescension. That he's across the color line. He's saying when I read that, I am finally free from the colorism that is in my society and that has even permeated, gotten into my own community. I'm free from that. And I felt that when I first picked up a work, I finally felt free of that tone. And I'm just looking at humanity nakedly, purely, right there. And I'm just looking at that story without the triggers of being Black in America. When I went to St. John's College, some people asked me, how did you have a good time at St. John's College? Because for the first time, I'm just reading, I'm just sitting down and I'm just talking about the human story. Like, I'm not made to have a discussion about what is it like to be Black in America. Like, I just want to have a conversation about being human. And I want to hear about how you're human. And then I want to build relationships that are not tainted by the division that we have in our society.
Which doesn't mean that you don't come back to the question of being Black in America, because
right.
you go back and forth.
Yes.
And so do we all
Yes.
who've been in part of the classical tradition.
Yes. Yes.
You know who else is free from the color line? Children.
Yes.
You know that, right?
Yes.
You get these 3-year-olds.
They don't care.
And it's just they model for us the kind of delight you can have to be in a garden of human beings.
Yes.
Ooh. Different colored flowers. And it's better for it.
And so what would happen if we taught without our politics and without our views on race? And there's a rule St. John's has, stick with the text. Leave your politics and your worldview at the door.
And everybody's Mr. and Miss.
Yes.
No matter your title or married or not.
Yep. The tutor's calling me Miss and I'm calling them Mr. or Miss. And we're just asking questions about the text. At first, it was hard for me to get used to because of my experience. You always feel like you got to kind of give some background knowledge on this, that, and history. But that rule was so liberating once I got the hang of it because it forced me to let go of my walls. Being the only Black person in a room to talk with someone who doesn't look like me. And I suspect it had the same effect on that other person. What would happen if we brought that into a classroom with children who are already free of that, besides what we put on them?
We need to see it.
Yes.
You're reminding me too of the Latin phrase alma mater, because we're both alumni of St. John's.
Yes.
So we have the
Loving
same
mother.
we have the same mother.
Yes,
so
yes.
We're siblings. We've been studying the
Yes.
same texts.
Yes.
And that does create a kind of sisterhood and brotherhood, doesn't it?
It does.
And
really does.
it's free of race.
Yes. Yeah.
Doesn't mean that race doesn't have its place, but it's free of it
Yes.
because we're reading the text.
The farther back to the ancient world you get, the freer from that you are. So like when you start out in the ancient world, it's just not there.
That's right.
You're going to read the Odyssey. I'm sorry. It's just not there. I'm sorry to disappoint people. But if you read Homer, you're not going to find anything racist in there. You're just not. It's just not there.
Yeah, and you're going to find that Phaeacia was a cool place, but apparently Ethiopia was a cool place too.
Yes, you will find them saying the beautiful Black Ethiopians. And when they say the word Black, I remember one time we had to read, I think it was Herodotus, the histories. As soon as they saw the word Black, he said we're Black. And they got offended by the word Black. And but then there were others who had read the whole text. And so when that came up in the discussion, someone else said, but did you keep reading? He called us Black and beautiful. She said us. Black and beautiful. Oh, I didn't see that. So we finished reading the text finally, and they're like, oh my gosh. I've never read a text written by someone from the European area that would put the word black and beautiful in the same sentence. They never experienced that. So when you're in the ancient world, you will experience that freedom. And you may think it's there. It's not there. You just have to release yourself from those grave clothes. It's not there. But as you get farther and farther away from the ancient world, you definitely aren't going to feel what we feel today, but you will begin to sense a leaving out of other people. The ancient world doesn't do the leaving out. They'll talk about Cyrus the Great from the Middle East. The Bible talks about everybody: Greeks, Romans, Jews, Black people, Ethiopian eunuch. I mean, Asia, everywhere. But so the farther away you get from the ancient world, you may not sense a racial framework, but you will begin to sense a leaving out of people of color. And I want to be honest about that. But still not the racially unkind things you may find in other literature. But you will notice that the conversation may start to narrow a little bit. But what remains the same still in the canon is they continue to work with the universal questions, which is why I can read it. And I may recognize when I read Pride and Prejudice, I know the time period that it's set in, somebody brown is somewhere around. But Jane chose to not include them in this story. But as I'm reading, I don't hear a language that's offensive. And I don't hear us being discussed in an inferior way. At the same time, Shakespeare wrote Othello. But he also wrote, is it The Merchant of Venice? It's one of his plays that has some anti-Semitism in it,
yes,
right?
That's The Merchant of Venice.
You know, so it's as you branch out from ancient into medieval, you do feel this freedom of nothing of what we're experiencing is there. Then as you get closer and closer to modern times, when race and the Middle Passage and the slave trade has come into being, this erasure of us. But the way it's written, you're still able to work through the universal questions. And so that's just a reality of it. And that's why I say, and the reason I'm bringing that up is I don't want to paint this rosy picture as in, just read the classics, there's no race in there, you'll be so happy.
You'll love Machiavelli.
Right. But I am trying to say how it works as you branch out, which is all the more reason, because the ancients, our foundation, started out telling everyone's story. If you chart Herodotus' journey from Greece all the way around, he traveled when he wrote their histories. He actually went to these places, back to Greece. There was a desire to see all the different shades of the human rainbow. When you leave the ancient world, that desire becomes less and less, which is all the more reason why we have to begin to think about, well, what is the system or the framework we need to put into place where we can reintroduce talking about diverse voices like the ancients did. That's how I see it. When we start welcoming those who have been inspired by these texts into the conversation, we are going back to that original frame.
It's interesting, when you use the word diverse voices, it's, to me, a sadness. Because right now you can't even use that word without triggering a number of people who think, oh, we know that move.
Yes.
You're doing DEI stuff, right? So that means you are clearly on the, just to use the vocabulary, is labeling you or somehow including you in a political movement and ideology. Whereas the word diverse is a fine word. Gardens are diverse. Variety is the spice of life in many contexts. With unity, a blend of unity and variety is that's part of what makes things beautiful. But boy, this idea that by returning to the classical tradition of these great voices in this canon, this great collection of literature, we are kind of relieved and liberated from some of the trappings that we feel, the being entrapped that we often feel in this moment where it's so partisan, so ideological, so triggering. we can find the fresh air, the fresh water.
Yes.
It gives us a new perspective by going back, and by going back, we go forward.
Yes. Oh, I love that.
It's
Yes.
that
Sankofa.
Yes, that's right. Let's go back and get it.
Yes.
And Chesterton said somewhere that every revolution is a restoration.
Oh.
Isn't that lovely?
Yes.
And he's thinking of how revolve means to come back around again.
Yes.
Right?
Yes,
So
yes.
really to revolt in the literal sense is to revolve.
Yes.
We're going to go back to something that's true, good, or beautiful.
Yep.
Discover it as if it were for the first time in our own experience, and then bring it to our families and our communities.
Yep. Yep.
Well, I hope this has been an encouragement to those of you who were able to view it. This has been Christopher Perrin and Anika Prather talking about the canon and a few other things.
Yes.
Thanks for watching. I'd like to thank you for watching or listening to the Christopher Perrin Show. And to do that, I can give you a coupon code that will give you 10% off on anything that you might care to order at ClassicalAcademicPress.com. And the coupon code is simply CP Show. Thanks again for listening or watching.